Welcome to another installment of a segment where we dive into one of Elder Scrolls Online's many sets and explore what sort of builds you can make. Not only will we show you how to get the most from these sets, but we'll explain where to get them, what requirements there are to obtain them, if any, and everything else you could possibly want to know about them. In this video, we'll take a look at the Blooddrinker Set, which increases damage done with bleeding effects. This set was added in the game with the Horns of the Reach DLC. It launched in August 2017 and introduced two new dungeons, Bloodroot Forge and Fogwreath Hold. The Blooddrinker set drops from bosses in Bloodroot Forge and is bind on pickup. You can acquire medium armor, weapons, and jewelry of this set in the Bloodforge motif style. The motif drops from Earthgore Almagam, the last boss in Bloodroot Forge, but only on veteran difficulty. Weapon and armor traits are random, meaning you are likely to have to farm pieces for different traits. This is a medium set, so enchantments on armor and weapon pieces are max stamina and absorb stamina. Jewelry comes with robust traits and stamina recovery enchantments. Keep in mind that you can use transmutation to change traits if you wish. However, the Somerset expansion is needed to change jewelry traits, along with 50 transmute crystals. The Blooddrinker set increases weapon critical by 1,666 and weapon damage by 129 with 4 pieces equipped. The 5-piece set bonus increases damage done with any bleeding effect by 20%. This set is aimed towards stamina DPS builds due to weapon critical and damage increases, and the many ways of inflicting bleeding with such builds. Damage in Elder Scrolls Online is split into two groups, physical and magical. Physical damage is mitigated by physical resistance, and magical damage is mitigated by spell resistance. Physical damage subtypes are poison, disease, and bleed, while magical damage subtypes are frost, shock, and flame. All physical damage subtypes are mitigated by physical resistance and their own mitigation, poison resistance for example. All magical damage subtypes are mitigated the same way, so for example, frost damage will be mitigated with spell resistance plus frost resistance before applying damage. Bleed is a physical damage type, but it is not like other physical damage, making it unique. It does damage over time that completely bypasses all physical resistance, making it extremely powerful. Bleeds can also critically strike, as well as trigger effects from sets such as Briarheart, Defiler, and other sets that proc by dealing damage. Bleed effects from sets like Twin Sisters cannot crit, however, because no damage from sets can crit. Bleeds from the same source, ability, set, etc. will refresh the bleed effect if used again. That means if you use the Carve ability twice, for example, you won't accomplish much because the bleed you already caused will just be replaced by the newer one. You can have as many bleeds active as you want at once as long as they come from different sources. The bleed effect can be applied in the following 3 ways, and bleed damage can be increased using the following methods. How this set works is whenever you bleed an enemy, that damage over time will be increased by 20%. The change is reflected in the tooltip of every source that inflicts bleed damage, and that applies to both abilities and sets. This means if the Twin Sisters set and Blooddrinker are both equipped, for example, the bleed tooltip damage of Twin Sisters will be increased by 20%. To maximize damage done with bleed from any source, you need to have lots of points in stamina, weapon damage, mighty, and thaumaturge. If the bleed source comes from an ACK or ability, then add precise strikes as well, because it increases crit damage of ticks. Bleed from sets cannot crit. Bleed damage can be increased further with the Minor and Major Berserk that increase damage done, and Minor and Major Brutality that both increase weapon damage. Let's see how high we can take the bleed tooltip damage with the Carve ability. Without any points into stamina, mighty, thaumaturge, or buffs, the tooltip displays 3,625 damage over 10 seconds. Adding 64 points into stamina, food buff active, 100 points into mighty and thaumaturge, and the Major Brutality buff, tooltip damage went up to 7,710. Keep in mind that the tooltip does not account for crits, so with 2 crits the total damage done was 9,930, with 70 points into precise strikes, even though the tooltip said only 7,710. Note that you do not need to worry about physical penetration, because all bleed damage bypasses physical resistance. Bleed is commonly used in any stamina DPS rotation. It is usually combined with poison and disease damage since both scale off the same stats and champion points. Blooddrinker is used to increase bleed damage only, not poison or disease, so it would be most beneficial if as much of the build as possible revolves around bleeds. To make the most out of such a build, we need 3 different bleed sources. That means axe, abilities, and another set. Twin Sisters is more for PvP because blocking is not used much in PvE as a DPS. Savage Werewolf will reset the bleed every time you light attack, which may occur just before it ticks, resulting in less effectiveness. So you have to be careful on your timing if you use this set. I would recommend either using Pillar of Nirn or Stinging Slashes. For dual-wielding builds, players like to use a dagger plus axe combination. Daggers offer more crit chance, and the axe gives a chance of proccing a bleed. Wearing 2 axes is not recommended because if you proc the bleed from both axes, one would reset the other, which can then cause a loss of overall DPS since the first one didn't have time to tick. Twin Slashes is one of the primary abilities used in such a build, and you can boost the damage of this ability specifically with the Stinging Slashes set. Dual-wielding players should use a two-handed weapon as a secondary so that they can use Carve. This is one additional bleed that can crit, and that is boosted by Blooddrinker. It also helps having forward momentum to increase weapon damage, which increases physical damage and lasts for a long time. The Titanic Cleave set is recommended if you went with Stinging Slashes, so that you can deal increased damage when you cleave. This set is great for werewolves as well, as they rely on bleed damage since it procs from their light attacks. Naturally, this is where Blooddrinker comes into play. Combining it with something like Shacklebreaker, Strength of the Automaton, Savage Werewolf, or Pillars of Nirn is a great way to increase overall DPS. For stamina DPS that relies on bleed, there are some Monster Helm sets that work better than others. Slimecraw grants Minor Berserk at all times, increasing damage from all sources by 8%. Selene has a 15% chance to do a high amount of physical damage, and Velodrith has a 20% chance to do a high amount of disease damage. Notes for PvP players. Bleed is very effective in PvP because it goes through resistances and can deal a lot of damage even to the most heavily armored opponents. This is where Blooddrinker will see most of its use, and the strategy here is simple. Stack bleeds on your target while DPSing in order to keep pressure on them. Add some sort of defiling effect, and you're golden. Blooddrinker is useful in PvP and PvE because the bleed effect is always used in stamina DPS rotations. In PvP, the set is even better due to bleed going through much more resistances than most enemies you face in PvE. The 20% increased damage is a good amount because it stacks with every other source that increases bleed damage, and all those sources are used in stamina DPS builds anyways to increase overall DPS. Since you can stack several bleeds on a target at once, this set becomes more potent the more you use. However, this does take some optimization and specific other sets to complement it in order to make it useful. Be sure to study the sections listed in this video so that you know the sources of bleeds, so you can determine what works best for you. Stay tuned as we'll be covering the rest of the SO sets, and be sure to check out our other SO guides.